Well, I'll be damned after all these years. It comes down to this. Martha Sullivan's weathered hands trembled as she cradled Cooper's massive head in her lap, the German shepherd's labored breathing sending puffs of vapor into the cold Kentucky air. Blood seeped through his silver-touched black fur, staining the fallen. Autumn leaves beneath them a deep crimson. The old dog's dark eyes, clouded with age and pain, gazed up at her with the same unwavering loyalty he'd shown for 12 years. "Easy, boy," Martha whispered, her voice cracking. "Easy now." But nothing about this moment was easy. The rocky outcropping of Mammoth Cave's entrance loomed behind them like a gaping mouth. And somewhere in that darkness little Grace Hayes lay unconscious, the python's venom coursing through her 7-year-old body. The shattered remains of Martha's police radio lay scattered across the limestone, destroyed in the chaos that had erupted just minutes before Cooper's flanks rose and fell in an irregular rhythm, each breath a struggle against the crushing damage the 20-foot Burmese python had inflicted. The massive snake lay motionless now, 20 yards away, its coils still glistening with blood, some Cooper's, some its own. The German shepherd had fought with the desperate fury of a protector, even as his aged body screamed in protest. Martha's fingers found the deep gashes along Cooper's ribs where the python's crushing embrace had torn through muscle and sinew. Her hands, once steady enough to aim a service weapon in the dark, now shook with more than just the autumn chill, the tremor that had started 6 months ago. The first sign of the disease that was slowly stealing her mind seemed to worsen in moments of stress. "I should have remembered," she muttered, pressing her palm against a particularly deep wound to stem the bleeding. "Should have known Frank was coming, but this damn disease." The sound of footsteps on gravel made her look up sharply through the mist that clung to the cave entrance. She could see the beam of a flashlight cutting through the gloom, moving with purpose. Frank Morrison was getting closer, and he still had his gun. "Lord have mercy," she thought. "I've seen a lot in my day, but nothing like this." Cooper's ear twitched at the approaching sound, and despite his injuries, he managed a low growl that rumbled in his chest. Even now, broken and bleeding, her old partner was trying to protect her. The thought sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over Martha. This noble animal had trusted her completely, followed her into this trap because she'd been too proud, too stubborn, to see the signs. The radio crackled once, a burst of static that made her heart leap with hope, but then fell silent again. Morrison had made sure of that when he'd smashed it against the cave wall during the confrontation. No one was coming to help, not for Cooper, not for Grace, not for any of them. Martha Morrison's voice echoed off the limestone walls, distorted by the cave's acoustics into something almost inhuman. "Martha, I know you're out there. We need to finish this conversation." She looked down at Cooper, whose breathing had become even more labored. A thin line of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and she knew with the cold certainty of her 30 years in law enforcement that time was running out for all of them. The flashlight beam grew brighter, closer. Morrison would round the bend in another minute, maybe two. Martha's hand instinctively went to her hip where her service weapon had once rested, but she'd been retired for 5 years now. No gun, no radio, no backup coming, just an old woman with a failing mind, a dying dog, and a little girl who needed saving. Cooper's eyes found hers again, and in their cloudy depths she saw something that made her throat tight with emotion. Not accusation, not fear, but the same steadfast devotion he'd shown since the day they'd been partnered. He didn't blame her for leading them into this nightmare. He never would. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "I'm so damn sorry." The footsteps stopped just beyond the curve in the trail. Morrison was close now, close enough that she could hear him breathing hard from the climb. In the distance, deeper in the cave system, she thought she could hear something else, a faint whimpering. That might have been Grace stirring back to consciousness. Martha closed her eyes and tried to remember how they'd gotten here, tried to push through the fog that seemed to cloud her thoughts more and more these days. There had been warnings, hadn't there? Signs she should have seen. Cooper's behavior around Frank, the way he'd refused to enter the cave system, the strange coincidence of Morrison showing up just as their senior group had planned this trip. The beam of Morrison's flashlight finally appeared around the bend, a pale circle of light that swept across the cave entrance before settling on Martha and Cooper huddled against the rocks. "There you are," Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of relief that somehow made it even more Menacing. I was starting to worry I'd lost you in all this chaos. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The Springfield Police Department had never looked more welcoming than it did on Martha O'Sullivan's last day of active duty. Golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the bullpen, casting everything in a warm glow that seemed to soften the harsh realities of 30 years in law enforcement. The smell of coffee and old case files hung in the air, mixed with the familiar scent of Cooper's fur, as the German shepherd lay contentedly beside her desk. "Well, Cooper, old boy," Martha said, scratching behind his ears as she packed the last of her personal items into a cardboard box. "Looks like we're hanging up our badges." Cooper's tail thumped against the linoleum floor, but his dark eyes remained alert, scanning the room with the same vigilance he'd shown every day for the past 8 years. At 4 years old, he was in his prime, muscular, sharp, with a coat as black as midnight, except for the small patch of white on his chest that looked like a star. "Martha, you've been the finest cop this town's ever seen," said Lieutenant Davis, approaching with a coffee-stained mug that read, "World's Okayest Boss." His weathered face creased into a genuine smile. "This place won't be the same without you. And that four-legged partner of yours." "Oh, stop it, Jim." Martha waved him off, but her cheeks flushed with pleasure. "You're just saying that because I caught more drug dealers than the rest of the department combined." "That's exactly why I'm saying it," Davis laughed. "Cooper, he's got a nose that could sniff out trouble from 3 counties away," as if summoned by the praised detective Frank Morrison emerged from the break room carrying 2 cups of coffee in 1999. Frank was 35, ambitious and eager to prove himself as Martha's junior partner. His sandy hair was perfectly combed, his uniform crisp, and his smile just a little too bright. "You taught me everything I know," partner Frank said, offering Martha one of the cups. "I don't know how I'm going to manage without your guidance." Martha accepted the coffee, noting how Cooper's ears flattened slightly when Frank approached. The dog had always been standoffish around her junior partner, though. Martha had attributed it to Cooper's naturally protective instincts. "You'll do just fine, Frank," she assured him. "You've got good instincts, trust them." Frank's smile faltered for just a moment, so briefly that Martha almost missed it. "Speaking of instincts, I was hoping to take a look at some of your old case files before you go." "Learn from the master, you know." "Which cases?" Martha asked, sipping her coffee and tasting the bitter edge of the department's notoriously strong brew. "Just some of the unsolved ones. The missing persons files, maybe some of the cold cases." Frank's tone was casual, but Cooper had risen to his feet, positioning himself between Frank and Martha's desk. Martha followed Cooper's gaze to her filing cabinet, where a thick folder marked "Missing Persons Unsolved" sat prominently on top. Inside were dozens of cases spanning her career, but one in particular had been haunting her thoughts lately: the Johnson family disappearance from 3 years ago. David and Sarah Johnson, along with their 5-year-old daughter Emma, had vanished without a trace after David had called the station claiming he'd witnessed something suspicious at the old warehouse district. "Some cases never let you go, Frank," Martha said quietly, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on Cooper's head. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Frank's eyes flickered to the file folder, then back to Martha's face. "Secrets can be dangerous things, Martha. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs like Cooper." Let out a low growl, so quiet that only Martha heard it. She frowned, looking down at her partner. In 8 years of working together, she'd never seen Cooper react this way to a fellow officer. "Easy boy," she murmured, but the German shepherd remained tense, his dark eyes fixed on Frank with an intensity that made Martha uncomfortable. The awkward moment was broken by the arrival of several other officers, including rookie patrolman Mike Chun and veteran Sergeant Betty Rodriguez, all carrying store-bought cake and wearing forced smiles. "Time for the official send-off," Betty announced, setting down a sheet cake decorated with a fondant police badge and the words "Happy Retirement, Martha and Cooper." As the small crowd gathered around Martha's desk, she found herself looking around the room with new eyes. This had been her second home for 3 decades. The place where she'd learned to trust her instincts, to read people, to separate truth from lies. The faded wanted posters on the bulletin board, the coffee rings on every surface, the perpetual stack of paperwork that somehow never seemed to get smaller. It all felt like pieces of herself that she was leaving behind. Speech, called out Officer Chun, and the others took up the shout. Martha stood feeling unexpectedly emotional. Well, I'll be damned if I know what to say. 30 years ago, I walked into this place thinking I knew what police work was all about. Turns out I didn't know squat. Laughter rippled through the group, but Martha's expression grew serious. What I learned here is that the job isn't about the badge or the gun or even catching the bad guys. It's about standing between good people and the darkness that wants to hurt them. And sometimes she looked down at Cooper, whose tail was wagging again now that the room was full of friendly faces. Sometimes you get a partner who reminds you every day what loyalty really means. The applause was warm and genuine, but Martha noticed that Frank had stepped back from the group. His attention focused on something beyond the celebration. She followed his gaze and saw him staring at her filing cabinet with an expression she couldn't quite read. Frank, she called out, everything all right? He turned back with that too bright smile. Of course, Martha, just thinking about all the cases we'll never solve together. After the cake was eaten and the well wishes exchanged, Martha found herself alone. With Cooper making one final sweep of the office, she opened the filing cabinet and pulled out the Johnson family folder. Flipping through the photographs and witness statements she'd read hundreds of times, David Johnson had been a warehouse worker, a family man with no enemies and no reason to disappear. His wife Sarah had been a part-time teacher beloved by her students. 5-year-old Emma had been a bright, happy child who loved to draw pictures of dogs. What did you see, David? Martha whispered to the photograph of a man with kind eyes and a work-worn face. What was worth killing a whole family over? Cooper winked softly and pressed against her leg, offering comfort in the way only he could. Martha closed the file and locked it back in the cabinet, but she made a mental note of its location. Retirement didn't mean she had to stop caring about justice. As they walked through the station for the last time, Cooper at her heel in perfect formation, Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She glanced back once and saw Frank Morrison standing by her old desk, his hand resting on the filing cabinet handle. Come on, boy, she murmured to Cooper, let's go home. But as they stepped into the parking lot, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that home might not be as safe as it used to be. The cold Kentucky air bit at Martha's face as she knelt beside Cooper's broken body, her arthritic fingers fumbling with the emergency radio that lay in pieces around them. The plastic casing had shattered when Frank Morrison threw it against the limestone wall, and now the scattered components mocked her desperate attempts to call for help. Think, Martha, think, she whispered harshly to herself, her breath forming small clouds in the autumn chill. Red button, blue button, damn this disease. She picked up what looked like the main unit, turning it over in her hands with the same confusion she'd felt that morning when she couldn't remember how to work the coffee maker. The buttons and switches that should have been as familiar as her own name now seemed like artifacts from another world, their purposes lost. In the fog that increasingly clouded her thoughts, Cooper's breathing grew more labored, each exhale accompanied by a wet rattle that made Martha's chest tight with panic. His dark eyes, usually so alert and intelligent, were growing dim with pain and blood loss. She pressed her hand against the worst of his wounds, feeling the warm stickiness seep between her fingers. Stay with me, boy, she pleaded. Cooper's counting on you. Grace is counting on you, but which button calls for help? The names felt strange on her tongue, as if she were speaking a foreign language. For a terrifying moment, she looked down at the injured dog and saw only a stranger, a large, dark animal bleeding on the cave floor. The panic that gripped her was worse than any physical pain she'd ever experienced. Who are you? She whispered, then immediately shook her head violently. No, you're Cooper, you're my partner, my good boy. The recognition came flooding back, bringing with it a wave of self-loathing that made her stomach churn. How could she forget Cooper even for a second? How could this disease be stealing away the most important relationships in her life? She found herself calling out a different name entirely. Rex, here, Rex, come here, boy. Rex had been her childhood dog, a golden retriever who died when she was 15, but for that moment sitting in the cave with Cooper bleeding in her lap. The past and present had merged into one confused timeline where nothing made sense. Cooper wed softly, a sound so heartbreaking that it cut through the fog in Martha's mind like a knife. She looked down at him, really looked, and saw the German shepherd who had been her partner, her protector, Her closest friend for 8 years of active duty and 5 years of retirement. I'm sorry, sweetheart, she whispered, stroking his graying muzzle. Grandma's mind is playing tricks again. The word grandma slipped out naturally, though Cooper wasn't her grandchild and she'd never had children of her own. It was just another sign of how twisted her thoughts had become, how the disease was rewiring the connections in her brain. In ways she couldn't control or predict, from somewhere deeper in the cave system came the sound of Frank Morrison's footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. He knew she was trapped, knew she had nowhere to run with Cooper injured, and Grace unconscious from the python's attack. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Frank had planned this, all of it. Why didn't I listen to Becca? Martha muttered, the memory surfacing like a bubble rising through murky water. She said something was wrong with Frank, but I thought I was just paranoid. Old age making me suspicious of everyone. The conversation had happened 3 weeks ago during one of their regular coffee dates at Mildred's diner. Rebecca Hayes had leaned across the table, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug, and spoken in the low, urgent tone she reserved for sharing gossip or genuine concerns. Martha, honey, I'm worried about that Morrison fellow. Becca had something about him just doesn't sit right with me. The way he looks at people, like he's calculating something. Martha had dismissed it at the time, chalking it up to Becca's natural suspicion of anyone in law enforcement. The older woman had never quite trusted cops, not since her son Danny had been arrested for drunk driving and treated roughly by the arresting officers. But now, sitting in the growing darkness with Cooper dying in her arms, Martha realized that Becca's instincts had been spotted. The nurse's training had taught her to read people, to spot the subtle signs of deception and danger that others might miss. Lord have mercy, Martha whispered, using one of her mother's favorite phrases. I've seen a lot in my day, but nothing like this. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was quoting her deceased mother while holding her dying partner. Both relationships now existing primarily in the increasingly unreliable realm of memory. Sometimes she could remember her mother's voice with perfect clarity, could hear the slight Kentucky accent that had never quite faded despite decades in Ohio. Other times she couldn't recall what her mother had looked like, or even her first name. Cooper's breathing stuttered, and for a terrifying moment, Martha thought he'd stopped altogether. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening for the steady heartbeat that had been her comfort through so many dangerous situations. There it was, weak and irregular, but still fighting. That's my brave boy, she murmured. Don't you dare give up on me now. The sound of Morrison's approach grew closer, and Martha found herself remembering fragments of conversations, pieces of a puzzle she should have assembled months ago. How had Frank known about the senior sense trip to Mammoth Cave? She'd mentioned it casually during their last encounter, but he'd seemed unusually interested, asking specific questions about dates and itineraries. And then there was the python itself, a massive Burmese python that had no business being in a Kentucky cave system. Someone had put it there, someone who knew the group would be exploring that particular section of the cave, someone who wanted to create chaos and confusion while he dealt with a problem that had been bothering him for 5 years. Martha's training kicked in despite the fog in her mind, and she began to piece together the timeline. The Johnson family had disappeared 3 years ago, right around the time Frank had been promoted to Detective. David Johnson had called the station claiming he'd witnessed something suspicious, but he'd never made it in to give his statement. The warehouse. Martha breathed the memory suddenly crystal clear. David saw something at the warehouse. It was coming back to her now in fragments and flashes that hurt her head but brought terrible clarity. The warehouse district, where several drug busts had gone wrong, where evidence had mysteriously disappeared, where Frank Morrison had been the lead investigator on multiple cases. Cooper stirred in her lap, his eyes opening briefly to look at her with an expression of such trust and loyalty that it broke her heart all over again. He was dying because of her mistakes, her failure to see the truth about Frank Morrison. An innocent animal was paying the price for her blindness. I should have known, she whispered to Cooper, her voice thick with guilt. You tried to tell me, didn't you? Dogs know things you knew. Frank was rotten from the beginning. The German shepherd's tail gave the faintest wag at the sound of her voice, and Martha felt tears She hadn't even realized she was crying drip onto his dark fur in that moment. Her mind was perfectly clear, unclouded by disease or confusion. She knew exactly where she was, who she was with, and what was at stake. Grace Hayes, sweet little Grace, with her gaptooth smile and endless questions, was lying unconscious somewhere in this cave system, possibly dying from python venom, while Martha sat here feeling sorry for herself. Becca would be frantic with worry, and the other seniors from their group were probably wandering around lost and terrified. Morrison's footsteps stopped just around the bend, close enough now that Martha could hear his breathing. She looked down at Cooper one more time, memorizing the pattern of silver and black in his fur, the noble shape of his head, the way his ears still twitched at every sound despite his injuries. "Whatever happens next, boy," she whispered, "I want you to know you've been the best partner an old cop could ask for." The morning had started with such promise, Martha remembered, as she sat in the passenger seat of the retirement community's charter bus 6 months earlier. Cooper dozed peacefully at her feet, his graying muzzle resting on his front paws, while outside the window the Kentucky rolled past in a blur of green hills and weathered barns. "Martha, honey, I'm worried about you," Rebecca Hayes had said during their coffee date the week before, her kind eyes creased with concern. "You forgot our coffee date 3 times this month and yesterday. You called me Patricia." Martha had waved off the concern with a dismissive laugh, though privately she'd been troubled by the increasing frequency of these small lapses. "Bless your heart, Becca, but I'm fine, just getting old. That's all happens to the best of us." But it wasn't just getting old, and they both knew it. The signs had been accumulating for months: forgotten appointments, repeated conversations, the growing confusion with everyday tasks that had once been second nature. Dr. Peterson had used gentle words during their last visit, speaking of mild cognitive decline and early stages, but Martha knew what he really meant. The decision to join the Springfield Retirement Community's organized trips had been Rebecca's idea, presented with the tactful persistence of someone who'd spent 40 years as a nurse and knew how to handle reluctant patients. "It'll be good for you to get out more," Becca had insisted, "and Grace would love to spend time with her grandma." Marty Grace, the little girl, had attached herself to Martha with the fierce devotion that only 7-year-olds could muster, declaring that Martha was now her honorary grandmother since her real grandparents lived too far away to visit. Martha had been touched by the gesture, though she'd noticed something unsettling in the child's artwork. Grace had taken to drawing pictures during their visits, innocent sketches of flowers and houses and dogs that looked remarkably like Cooper, but mixed in with these cheerful images were darker drawings that made Martha's retired cop instincts prickle with unease. Pictures of a tall man with a gun, always rendered in angry black crayon strokes. When Martha had asked about them, Grace had simply shrugged. "That's the bad man from my dreams," she'd said matter-of-factly, as if nightmares about armed strangers were perfectly normal for a second grader. Martha had tried to question her further, but Grace had already moved on to another drawing, this one showing Cooper wearing what looked like a police badge made of yellow crayon. Children's drawings were often strange and inexplicable. Martha had told herself there was no reason to read sinister meanings into the imagination of a traumatized child because Grace was traumatized. That much was clear. Becca had been carefully vague about the little girl's background, mentioning only that Grace had come to live with her after family troubles and that the legal arrangements were still being finalized. It wasn't uncommon for nurses to take in children who needed homes. Martha had seen it happen dozens of times during her career. The unexpected visit from Frank Morrison had come just 2 days before the Mammoth cave trip was scheduled to depart. Martha had been surprised to see her former partner standing on her front porch holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers and wearing the same too bright smile that had always made Cooper uncomfortable. "Just thought I'd check on my old partner," Frank had said, though something in his eyes suggested this wasn't a social call. "See how retirement's treating you." They'd sat in Martha's living room drinking coffee and making small talk about mutual acquaintances and department gossip, but Cooper had been agitated throughout the visit, pacing restlessly and occasionally letting out low whines that Martha couldn't interpret. The German Shepherd had always been standoffish around Frank, but this was different, more intense, more urgent. "How are you keeping busy these days?" Frank had asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp with interest. "I imagine retirement can get pretty boring after 30 years on the force." "Oh, same old routine," Martha had replied, "though I'm thinking about taking a little trip next week." The Retirement community is organizing something to Mammoth Cave. Figured it might be nice to get out and see something new. Frank's interest had seemed to sharpen at this news, though he'd tried to hide it behind another of those practiced smiles. Mammoth Cave, that's a beautiful area, very remote, lots of places to explore off the beaten path. He pulled a glossy brochure from his jacket pocket, unfolding it to reveal pictures of limestone formations and underground rivers. You should definitely visit the back sections, he'd said, pointing to a particular area marked on the tourist map. That's where the real treasures are hidden. The conversation had moved on to other topics, but Martha noticed that Frank had left the brochure behind when he departed. She'd found it later that evening folded on the coffee table with specific cave sections circled in blue ink. At the time, she'd assumed he was just being helpful, sharing his knowledge of local attractions. It was only later, after Frank had gone and she was getting ready for bed, that Martha realized her living room window was slightly open, a window she was certain she'd left securely latched. The discovery had sent a chill down her spine, though she'd tried to rationalize it away. Maybe she'd opened it earlier and forgotten. Maybe the latch was loose. Maybe her increasingly unreliable memory was playing tricks on her again, but Cooper had spent the rest of the evening prowling the house, checking windows and doors with the methodical thoroughness of a working police dog. His behavior had been so unusual that Martha had almost called the station to report a possible break-in. "What's wrong, boy?" she'd asked, watching as Cooper sniffed carefully around the areas where Frank had been sitting. "You never acted like that with Frank before. It's like you can smell something I can't." The German Shepherd had looked up at her with an expression of such clear warning that Martha felt her blood run cold. Cooper had always been an excellent judge of character, able to sense deception and danger in ways that often surprised even experienced officers. If he was this agitated about Frank Morrison, there had to be a reason. The next morning, Martha had called the department and asked to speak with Lieutenant Davis, ostensibly to ask about the status of some old case files, but what she'd really wanted was information about Frank's recent activities. His case load, his behavior patterns. Davis had been chatty and informative, mentioning that Frank had been working a lot of overtime lately, spending unusual amounts of time reviewing cold cases. "Funny thing," Davis had said, "he's been particularly interested in some of your old files." Martha asked specifically about the Johnson family disappearance. You remember that one? Martha had remembered it all too well. David and Sarah Johnson, along with their 5-year-old daughter Emma, had vanished 3 years ago. After David had called the station claiming he'd witnessed something suspicious. The case had haunted Martha throughout her final years on the Force A puzzle, with too many missing pieces and too few leads. Did Frank say why he was interested in that particular case? Martha had asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Said he thought there might be new evidence, something that had been overlooked the first time around. You know how these young detectives are always convinced they can solve the cases us old-timers couldn't crack. But Martha knew Frank well enough to recognize the signs of obsession, and his sudden interest in the Johnson case worried her more than she cared to admit. There had been something off about that investigation from the beginning. Too many convenient dead ends and missing witnesses. At the time, she'd attributed the problems to bad luck and bureaucratic incompetence. Now she was beginning to wonder if there had been a more sinister explanation. The decision to go ahead with the Mammoth Cave trip had been Martha's way of testing her suspicions. If Frank's interest in her travel plans was innocent, nothing would happen, but if her growing paranoia was justified, well, at least she'd know the truth. She'd had no idea that the truth would cost Cooper his life. Grace's lips had turned a frightening shade of blue, and Rebecca Hayes felt her 40 years of nursing experience kick into overdrive as she knelt beside the unconscious child on the cold cave floor. The little girl's breathing was shallow and labored, her pulse racing from whatever toxin the massive python had injected during its brief contact with her exposed skin. "Come on, baby," girl, Becca whispered urgently, her weathered hands working quickly to check Grace's vital signs. "Stay with Grandma, Becca. Don't you dare leave me too." She pulled the emergency medical kit from her backpack with practiced efficiency, her fingers finding the small vial of epinephrine she always carried since Grace had developed her severe allergy to bee stings. It wasn't designed for snake venom, but it might buy them precious time by keeping the child's airways open and her heart beating steadily. The needle went into Grace's thigh with the quick precision of someone who'd administered thousands of injections over her career. Becca watched anxiously for any sign of improvement, counting seconds that felt like hours as she monitored the rise and fall of Grace's chest. Earlier that morning, the world had seemed so much simpler. The chartered bus from Springfield Retirement Community had pulled into the Mammoth Cave Visitor Center parking lot right on schedule, disgorging its cargo of excited seniors who chattered about the adventure ahead like school children on a field trip. Earl Thompson had been in his element, regaling anyone who would listen with stories from his days as a coal miner in these same Kentucky hills back. In my day, we knew every inch of these caves. The 72-year-old had declared, his voice still carrying the rasp of someone who'd spent decades breathing cold dust, dangerous as hell but beautiful like a cathedral made by God himself. Dorothy Wilson, Martha's closest friend in the retirement community, had fussed over everyone's preparations with the maternal efficiency of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "Now, Martha, honey, you make sure Cooper stays close," she'd warned. "These caves can be tricky, and I don't want you wandering off and getting lost." Grace had been practically vibrating with excitement, her small hand clutched tightly in Becca's as they approached the cave entrance. The little girl had peppered their guide with an endless stream of questions about bats and underground rivers and whether they might see any real live bears hiding in the darkness. But Cooper had been different from the moment they'd arrived. The German shepherd, usually eager to explore new places, had planted himself firmly at the cave entrance and refused to move forward. His hackles were raised, his ears flattened against his skull, and he'd let out a series of low whines that made Martha frown with concern. "What's wrong, boy?" Martha had asked, kneeling down to stroke his graying fur. "You're acting like there's something dangerous in there." Their guide, a cheerful park ranger named Tom Bradley, had tried to reassure the group. "Dogs sometimes sense things we can't," he'd explained with the patience of someone who dealt with countless worried pet owners. "Bats could be the change in air pressure. Maybe he smells a bear that passed through earlier." But Martha had known it wasn't bears or bats that had Cooper. So, agitated in 8 years of partnership, she'd learned to read her dog's body language like a book, and everything about his posture screamed danger. Still, she'd been reluctant to cause a scene in front of the other seniors, especially when her memory problems were already making her feel vulnerable and confused. Now, as Becca worked frantically to save Grace's life, she could hear Martha's voice echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system, though the words were too distorted by the limestone walls to make out clearly. There were other sounds, too. The scrape of shoes on stone, the distant murmur of voices, and something else that made her blood run cold, the sound of Frank Morrison's breathing. Becca had encountered Morrison several times over the years, usually when he'd stop by to visit Martha or when their paths had crossed at community events. She'd never liked him, though. She'd been hard-pressed to explain exactly why. There was something about his eyes, the way they seemed to catalog everything and everyone around him, like a predator evaluating potential prey. Martha Morrison's voice echoed through the cave system, distorted and magnified until it sounded like the voice of some ancient malevolent spirit. "Martha, No, you're out there, you're out. We need to finish this conversation." Becca pressed herself closer to Grace, instinctively shielding the child's body with her own. The epinephrine seemed to be working. Grace's color was improving slightly, and her breathing had become less labored, but she was still unconscious and vulnerable. The memories came flooding back now, pieces of a puzzle that Becca should have assembled months ago. Grace's nightmares about the bad man with the gun, the way the little girl would sometimes freeze when she heard certain voices on television, particularly the deep, authoritative tones that reminded her of police officers, the carefully vague explanations about Grace's background, the rushed legal proceedings, the insistence that they needed to keep Grace's presence in Springfield as quiet as possible. Grace wasn't just any orphan child that Becca had taken in out of kindness. She was a witness, a survivor, a living piece of evidence that someone had been very eager to eliminate 2 hours earlier when they'd first entered the cave system. Becca had noticed Morrison lurking near the visitor center parking lot. At the time, she'd assumed it was a coincidence. Springfield was a small town, and it wasn't unusual to run into people you knew when traveling to nearby attractions, but now she realized that Morrison had been waiting for them, watching for the perfect moment to make his move. The python itself had been another shock. Burmese pythons weren't. Native to Kentucky and a specimen that large couldn't have survived in the cave system naturally. Someone had put it there deliberately, creating a chaotic diversion that would allow them to operate without interference from park rangers or other tourists. Grace stirred slightly her eyelids, fluttering as consciousness began to return. Becca leaned down close to the child's ear, whispering words of comfort and encouragement. "That's it, sweetheart. Come back to me. Everything's going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, Becca wasn't sure she believed them. Morrison was somewhere in these caves, armed and dangerous, and Martha was trapped with an injured dog and a failing memory. The other members of their senior group were scattered throughout the cave system, probably lost and frightened and completely unaware of the deadly game being played around them. Grace's eyes opened fully, focusing with difficulty on Becca's face. "Grandma Becca," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is Cooper okay?" "I heard him barking, and then the big snake baby girl," Becca soothed, stroking Grace's hair. "Cooper's with Martha. They're both going to be fine," but the lie tasted bitter. In her mouth, she'd heard the sounds of the fight between Cooper and the python, the terrible noises of animal combat that had echoed through the limestone. A possible break-in. "What's wrong, boy?" she'd asked, watching as Cooper sniffed carefully around the areas where Frank had been sitting. "You never acted like that with Frank before. It's like you can smell something I can't." The German shepherd had looked up at her with an expression of such clear warning that Martha felt her blood run cold. Cooper had always been an excellent judge of character, able to sense deception and danger in ways that often surprised even experienced officers. If he was this agitated about Frank Morrison, there had to be a reason. The next morning, Martha had called the department and asked to speak with Lieutenant Davis, ostensibly to ask about the status of some old case files. But what she'd really wanted was information about Frank's recent activities, his caseload, his behavior patterns. Davis had been chatty and informative, mentioning that Frank had been working a lot of overtime lately, spending unusual amounts of time reviewing cold cases. "Funny thing, Davis had said he's been particularly interested in some of your old files," Martha asked. "Specifically about the Johnson family disappearance. You remember that one?" Martha had remembered it all too well. David and Sarah Johnson, along with their 5-year-old daughter Emma, had vanished 3 years ago after David had called the station, claiming he'd witnessed something suspicious. The case had haunted Martha throughout her final years on the force, a puzzle with too many missing pieces and too few leads. "Did Frank say why he was interested in that particular case?" Martha had asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "He thought there might be new evidence, something that had been overlooked the first time around. You know how these young detectives are always convinced they can solve the cases us old-timers couldn't crack?" But Martha knew Frank well enough to recognize the signs of obsession, and his sudden interest in the Johnson case worried her more than she cared to admit. There had been something off about that investigation from the beginning. Too many convenient dead ends and missing witnesses. At the time, she'd attributed the problems to bad luck and bureaucratic incompetence. Now she was beginning to wonder if there had been a more sinister explanation. The decision to go ahead with the Mammoth Cave trip had been Martha's way of testing her suspicions. If Frank's interest in her travel plans was innocent, nothing would happen. But if her growing paranoia was justified, well, at least she'd know the truth. She'd had no idea that the truth would cost Cooper his life. Grace's lips had turned a frightening shade of blue, and Rebecca Hayes felt her 40 years of nursing experience kick into overdrive as she knelt beside the unconscious child on the cold cave floor. The little girl's breathing was shallow and labored, her pulse racing from whatever toxin the massive python had injected during its brief contact with her exposed skin. "Come on, baby girl," Becca whispered urgently, her weathered hands working quickly to check Grace's vital signs. "Stay with Grandma, Becca. Don't you dare leave me too." She pulled the emergency medical kit from her backpack with practiced efficiency, her fingers finding the small vial of epinephrine she always carried since Grace had developed her severe allergy to bee stings. It wasn't designed for snake venom, but it might buy them precious time by keeping the child's airways open and her heart beating steadily. The needle went into Grace's thigh with the quick precision of someone who'd administered thousands of injections over her career. Becca watched anxiously for any sign of improvement, counting seconds that felt like hours as she monitored the rise and fall of Grace's chest. Earlier that morning, the world had seemed so much simpler. The chartered bus from Springfield Retirement Community had pulled into the Mammoth Cave Visitor Center parking lot right on schedule, disgorging its cargo of excited seniors who chattered about the adventure ahead. Like schoolchildren on a field trip, Earl Thompson had been in his element, regaling anyone who would listen with stories from his days as a coal miner in these same Kentucky hills. Back in my day, we knew every inch of these caves. The 72-year-old had declared, his voice still carrying the rasp of someone who'd spent decades breathing coal dust, dangerous as hell but beautiful like a cathedral made by God himself. Dorothy Wilson, Martha's closest friend in the retirement community, had fussed over everyone's preparations with the maternal efficiency of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "Now, Martha, honey, you make sure Cooper stays close," she'd warned. "These caves can be tricky, and I don't want you wandering off and getting lost." Grace had been practically vibrating with excitement, her small hand clutched tightly in Becca's as they approached the cave entrance. The little girl had peppered their guide with an endless stream of questions about bats and underground rivers and whether they might see any real live bears hiding in the darkness, but Cooper had been different from the moment they'd arrived. The German shepherd, usually eager to explore new places, had planted himself firmly at the cave entrance and refused to move forward. His hackles were raised, his ears flattened against his skull, and he'd let out a series of low whines that made Martha frown with concern. "What's wrong, boy?" Martha had asked, kneeling down to stroke his graying fur. "You're acting like there's something dangerous in there." Their guide, a cheerful park ranger named Tom Bradley, had tried to reassure the group. "Dogs sometimes sense things we can't," he'd explained with the patience of someone who dealt with countless worried pet owners. "Bats could be the change in air pressure. Maybe he smells a bear that passed through earlier." But Martha had known it wasn't bears or bats that had Cooper. So, agitated in 8 years of partnership, she'd learned to read her dog's body language like a book, and everything about his posture screamed danger. Still, she'd been reluctant to cause a scene in front of the other seniors, especially when her memory problems were already making her feel vulnerable and confused. Now, as Becca worked frantically to save Grace's life, she could hear Martha's voice echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system, though the words were too distorted by the limestone walls to make out clearly. There were other sounds, too. The scrape of shoes on stone, the distant murmur of voices, and something else that made her blood run cold, the sound of Frank Morrison's breathing. Becca had encountered Morrison several times over the years, usually when he'd stop by to visit Martha or when their paths had crossed at community events. She'd never liked him, though. She'd been hard-pressed to explain exactly why. There was something about his eyes, the way they seemed to catalog everything and everyone around him like a predator evaluating potential prey. Martha Morrison's voice echoed through the cave system, distorted and magnified until it sounded like the voice of some ancient malevolent spirit. "Martha, No, you're out there, you're out. We need to finish this conversation." Becca pressed herself closer to Grace, instinctively shielding the child's body with her own. The epinephrine seemed to be working. Grace's color was improving slightly, and her breathing had become less labored, but she was still unconscious and vulnerable. The memories came flooding back now, pieces of a puzzle that Becca should have assembled months ago. Grace's nightmares about the bad man with the gun, the way the little girl would sometimes freeze when she heard certain voices on television, particularly the deep authoritative tones that reminded her of police officers, the carefully vague explanations about Grace's background, the rushed legal proceedings, the insistence that they needed to keep Grace's presence in Springfield as quiet as possible. Grace wasn't just any orphan child that Becca had taken in out of kindness. She was a witness, a survivor, a living piece of evidence that someone had been very eager to eliminate 2 hours earlier when they'd first entered the cave system. Becca had noticed Morrison lurking near the visitor center parking lot. At the time, she'd assumed it was a coincidence. Springfield was a small town, and it wasn't unusual to run into people you knew when traveling to nearby attractions, but now she realized that Morrison had been waiting for them, watching for the perfect moment to make his move. The python itself had been another shock. Burmese pythons weren't native to Kentucky, and a specimen that large couldn't have survived in the cave system naturally. Someone had put it there deliberately. creating a chaotic diversion that would allow them to operate without interference from park rangers or other tourists. Grace stirred slightly her eyelids. Fluttering as consciousness began to return, Becca leaned down close to the child's ear, whispering words of comfort and encouragement. "That's it, sweetheart, come back to me. Everything's going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, Becca wasn't sure she believed them. Morrison was somewhere in these caves, armed and dangerous, and Martha was trapped with an injured dog and a failing memory. The other members of their senior group were scattered throughout the cave system, probably lost and frightened and completely unaware of the deadly game being played around them. Grace's eyes opened, fully focusing with difficulty on Becca's face. Knee chambers. She'd heard Cooper's pain-filled yelps, Martha's desperate cries, and then a silence that was somehow worse than any sound. "The bad man?" Grace whispered, her small hand clutching at Becca's sleeve. "He's here, isn't he, the one from my dreams?" Becca's heart clenched with a mixture of love and terror. Grace was only 7 years old, but she'd already seen things that no child should ever witness. The trauma counselor had said that Grace's memories of that terrible night 3 years ago might never fully return. Her young mind had blocked out the worst details as a protective mechanism. But some memories couldn't be suppressed forever, and the sound of Morrison's voice in the cave had clearly triggered something deep and primal in Grace's psyche. "Listen to me, sweetheart," Becca said, her voice firm despite her fear. "I need you to be very brave right now. Can you do that for me?" Grace nodded solemnly, her young face set with determination that reminded Becca painfully of her own son Danny at that age. "We're going to find a safe place to hide until help comes," Becca continued, "just like we practiced at home. Remember the quiet game where we have to be as still and silent as little mice." Morrison's footsteps were getting closer now, the sound of his boots on stone echoing through the cavern. With methodical precision, he was searching for them, systematically checking every alcove and chamber with the thoroughness of a trained investigator. Time was running out, and Frank Morrison stepped into the pale circle of his flashlight beam, and Martha felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. He looked different than she remembered, harder somehow, with deep lines etched around his eyes and a coldness in his expression that she'd never noticed during their years as partners. His service weapon was drawn and pointed casually in her direction, though his finger wasn't on the trigger yet. "Martha, you always were too smart for your own good," Frank said, his voice carrying that same false warmth she now recognized as manipulation should have left well enough alone. Cooper tried to lift his head at the sound of Frank's voice, a low growl rumbling in his damaged chest. Despite his injuries, even dying, Martha's faithful partner was still trying to protect her. The sight of the brave dog's futile defiance made her heart break all over again. "Frank?" Martha said carefully, her voice steadier than she felt. "What are you doing here? How did you know where to find us?" Frank's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Come on, Martha. You were always the best detective in Springfield, but retirement's made you sloppy. You think I didn't notice you asking questions about the Johnson case? You think I didn't know you'd eventually put the pieces together? The Johnson case." The name hit Martha like a physical blow, and suddenly fragments of memory began falling into place like pieces of a shattered mirror reassembling themselves. David Johnson, the warehouse worker who'd called the station claiming he'd witnessed something suspicious. Sarah Johnson, the elementary school teacher who'd never missed a day of work until the day she vanished. And little Emma Johnson, 5 years old, who'd loved to draw pictures of dogs and horses and had been found 3 days later in a drainage ditch outside town. "You killed them." Martha whispered the words, scraping her throat raw. "The Johnson family. It wasn't a gang killing like the report said. It was you." Frank's expression shifted, revealing something cold and reptilian beneath the facade of the man she'd thought she knew. "They saw something they shouldn't have. David Johnson was working late at the warehouse, probably trying to earn some overtime money for his family. Wrong place, wrong time." "What did he see, Frank?" Martha demanded, though she was beginning to suspect. She already knew the answer. "Me loading evidence bags into the trunk of my car," Frank admitted with disturbing casualness. "Drugs, mostly cash from busts that never made it to the evidence locker. I'd been skimming for years, just small amounts at first. But then I got greedy." Martha felt sick. "How many cases, Frank? How many criminals walked free because you stole their evidence?" "Does it matter?" Frank shrugged. "Most of them were small-time dealers anyway, the kind of scum who'd be back on the streets In 6 months, regardless, at least this way, somebody benefited from their crimes. The casual way he dismissed his betrayal of everything they'd sworn to uphold made Martha's hands shake with rage, and when David Johnson saw you decided he had to die along with his wife and daughter. I tried to reason with him first. Frank said, as if he were describing a minor inconvenience, offered him money, threatened him, even considered bringing him in as a partner. But David was one of those annoying moral types, said he had to do the right thing, had to think about his family's safety. So you killed his family to keep them safe? Martha's voice dripped with disgust. I killed his family to send a message, Frank corrected, to anyone else who might be tempted to stick their nose where it didn't belong. Word gets around. In a small town, Martha people knew what happened to the Johnsons, even if they couldn't prove it. Made everyone a lot more careful about what they saw and what they reported. Frank's casual admission of murdering an entire family made Martha feel like she was falling into a bottomless pit of horror. This wasn't the man she'd worked alongside for years, the detective she'd trained and mentored and trusted with her life on countless occasions. This was a monster wearing Frank Morrison's face. But you made a mistake, Martha said, her detective instincts kicking in despite her emotional turmoil. Emma Johnson, she didn't die that night. Did she? Frank's smile faltered for the first time. Very good, Martha. I always said you were the smartest cop in Springfield. The pieces were falling into place now with sickening clarity. Grace Hayes isn't Rebecca's distant relative. She's Emma Johnson. Isn't she the surviving daughter? Emma was supposed to die with the rest of her family, Frank said, his voice taking on a harder edge. I shot her just like the others, left her for dead in that drainage ditch. But children are resilient, aren't they? Somehow she survived long enough for someone to find her and get her to the hospital. Martha remembered now the emergency call that had come in 3 years ago. A critically injured child found by hikers rushed to Springfield General with multiple gunshot wounds and severe trauma. The child had been in a coma for weeks, and when she'd finally awakened, she'd had no memory of her name or her family. Rebecca was the nurse that night, Martha said, understanding flooding through her like a tide. She took care of Emma, helped her recover, and when social services couldn't identify her, Rebecca Hayes did what she always does. Frank finished. She took in a child who needed a home, changed the girl's name, moved her across town, created a whole new identity. Very noble of her, really too bad it won't save either of them. The revelation about Grace's true identity explained so much. The nightmares about the bad man with the gun, the way she'd attached herself to Martha with such fierce devotion, the dark drawings that had troubled Martha so deeply. Grace might not consciously remember witnessing her family's murder, but some part of her mind had retained the trauma. You've been watching them, Martha said, waiting for the right opportunity. 3 years, Martha, 3 years of wondering if that little girl's memories would ever come back, if she'd ever remember enough to identify me. Rebecca did an admirable job keeping her hidden, but children grow up. They start asking questions about their past, wanting to know where they came from. So you decided to eliminate the threat. I decided to tie up loose ends, Frank corrected, just like I'm doing now with you. You've been poking around in old files, asking questions about cold cases. How long before you started connecting dots between my financial situation and some of those missing evidence bags? Martha's mind raced, trying to find some advantage, some way to turn the situation around, but Frank had planned this carefully, choosing a location where screams wouldn't carry, where bodies might never be found, where he could claim that a tragic accident had befallen the Springfield retirement community's cave expedition, the Python. She said suddenly, you put it in the cave system. Frank nodded approvingly. Impressive, isn't it? Bought it from a black market dealer in Louisville? Those things can grow to enormous sizes if you feed them properly. I've been keeping it in abandoned barn outside town, waiting for the right opportunity. Use it. You're insane. I'm practical, Frank corrected. Python attacks are rare but not unheard of in cave systems, especially with invasive species being released by irresponsible pet owners. A group of elderly tourists get surprised by a giant snake. Panic ensues. Tragic accidents happen. The snake dies in the confrontation, and there's no evidence pointing back to me. Cooper stirred in Martha's lap, his breathing becoming more labored. Blood from his wounds had soaked through her clothes, and she could feel his body temperature dropping. Her faithful partner was dying, and there was nothing she could do to save him. "Please, Frank," she said, hating the way her voice broke. "Let me get help for Cooper. He suffered enough." Frank looked down at the injured German shepherd with something that might have been genuine regret. "You know, I always liked that dog. He had good instincts. About people never did warm up to me, did he?" He knew, Martha whispered somehow. "He always knew what you really were." "Dogs are smarter than people sometimes," Frank agreed. "Too bad this one chose the wrong side." The massive Burmese python emerged from the deeper recesses of the cave like something from a nightmare. Its 20 feet length undulating across the limestone floor with predatory grace. Frank Morrison spun around at the sound of scales scraping against stone, his flashlight beam catching the serpent's eyes and reflecting back 2 points of cold ancient malice. "What the hell?" Frank began, but his words were cut short as the python struck with lightning speed, its powerful coils wrapping around his torso before he could bring his weapon to bear. Martha watched in horrified fascination as the man who had confessed to murdering an entire family was suddenly locked in mortal combat with the very weapon he had planned to use against her. Frank's gun clattered across the cave floor, sliding into a crevice beyond reach as he struggled desperately against the constricting embrace of the massive serpent. The python was even larger than she had initially thought, its body as thick as a tree trunk and marked with the distinctive pattern of a Burmese python that had been fed well and grown to monstrous proportions. This was no wild animal that had wandered into the cave system by accident. This was a deliberately cultivated killing machine raised and trained for exactly this purpose. Frank's screams echoed off the limestone walls, a sound of pure terror that should have filled Martha with satisfaction but instead left her feeling hollow and sick. Even knowing what he had done, watching another human being crushed to death was almost more than she could bear. Cooper stirred weakly in her lap, his dark eyes focusing with difficulty on the life and death struggle taking place just yards away. Despite his injuries, the German shepherd tried to rise, his protective instincts overriding his pain as he attempted to position himself between Martha and the deadly confrontation. "Easy, boy," Martha whispered, pressing her hand gently against Cooper's chest to keep him still. "Stay down, there's nothing we can do." But even as she spoke the words, Martha's mind was racing with the terrible implications of what was happening. Frank Morrison was the only person who knew they were in this cave system. He had destroyed her radio, isolated them from help, and now he was being killed by his own monstrous creation. If he died, would anyone ever find them? The python's coils tightened with mechanical precision, each squeeze calculated to crush bones and stop circulation. Frank's face was turning purple, his eyes bulging as he gasped for air that wouldn't come. His struggles were becoming weaker, more desperate, as the serpent's ancient patience wore down his human panic. Martha found herself confronting a moral dilemma that to the very core of her identity as a police officer. Frank Morrison was a murderer, a corrupt cop who had betrayed everything she held sacred. He had killed an innocent family, stolen evidence, and planned to murder her and Grace to cover his crimes by any measure of justice. He deserved to die for what he had done, but watching him being slowly crushed to death by the python he had raised as a weapon made Martha's stomach churn with revulsion. This wasn't justice. This was something primitive and brutal that went against every principle she had sworn to uphold during her 30 years in law enforcement. 5 years, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over Frank's weakening struggles. 5 years I worked alongside a killer. How many signs did I miss? How many times did Cooper try to warn me? The guilt was overwhelming, a crushing weight that seemed to press down on her chest like the python's coils were wrapped around Frank's body. She had trained him, mentored him, trusted him with sensitive information and access to evidence. How many other crimes had he committed with her unwitting assistance? How many other families had suffered because she had been too blind to see the monster hiding behind Frank Morrison's badge? Cooper's breathing was becoming more labored, each exhale accompanied by a wet rattle that told Martha his internal injuries were worse than she had feared. Blood from his wounds had soaked through her pants, and she could feel his body temperature dropping as shock set in. Her faithful partner was dying in her arms while she sat helplessly watching Frank Morrison face his own mortality. Those poor babies. Martha said, her voice thick with emotion as she remembered the crime scene photos from the Johnson case, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, little Emma, so scared and alone. If I'd been smarter, if I'd seen through Frank's lies. The memories came flooding back. Now, with crystal clarity, David Johnson had been found shot execution style in his own living room. His wife Sarah killed in the kitchen where she had apparently been preparing dinner. 5-year-old Emma had been discovered in the drainage ditch 3 miles from the house, left for dead but somehow clinging to life despite multiple gunshot wounds at the time. Frank had been the lead investigator on the case. He had theorized that the killings were the work of a drug gang, pointing to evidence of a break-in, and the family's modest lifestyle is proof that they had been random victims of violence. His investigation had been thorough, professional, and completely fabricated. Frank's movements were becoming sluggish, now his face taking on the grayish pore of oxygen deprivation. The python sensed its victim's weakening resistance and adjusted its grip, shifting its coils to maximize pressure on Frank's chest and neck. The serpent's eyes never blinked, never showed emotion as it carried out the execution with mechanical efficiency. Cooper made a soft whimpering sound that cut through Martha's spiral of guilt and self-ramation. She looked down at her partner, seeing the pain in his clouded eyes and the trust that somehow remained undiminished despite everything that had happened. Cooper didn't blame her for leading them into this trap. He never would. "Oh, Cooper," Martha whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his graying muzzle. "You beautiful, brave boy, I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." The decision came to her suddenly, cutting through the fog of her failing memory with startling clarity. She couldn't save Cooper. His injuries were too severe, and they were too far from help, but she could try to save Frank Morrison even if he didn't deserve it. Even if saving him meant he might still try to kill her, and Grace Martha had spent 30 years believing that everyone deserved justice, not just the people she liked or approved of. Frank Morrison was a murderer and a corrupt cop, but he was still a human being, and human beings, no matter how fallen, didn't deserve to be slowly crushed to death by a 20-foot python. "Stay here, boy," she whispered to Cooper, gently lifting his head from her lap and settling him as comfortably as possible against the cave wall. "I'll be right back." The German shepherd's eyes followed her movements, confusion and concern evident in his expression. He tried to rise to follow her, but his strength was fading fast. Martha stood on unsteady legs, her joints protesting after sitting motionless for so long. The cave floor was littered with loose rocks of various sizes, debris that had fallen from the ceiling over thousands of years of geological activity. She selected a piece of limestone about the size of a softball, hefting its weight in her hands as she approached the struggling figures of Frank and the python. Frank's eyes found hers as she drew near, and in them she saw something she had never expected to see from him: gratitude. He knew what she was planning to do, knew that she was risking her own life to save the man who had planned to murder her. Martha raised the rock above her head, took careful aim at the python's skull, and brought it down with all the force her 70-year-old body could muster. The impact was solid and decisive, crushing scales and bone with a wet cracking sound that echoed through the cave. The python's grip loosened instantly, its massive body going limp as its nervous system shut down. Frank Morrison collapsed to the cave floor, gasping and retching as oxygen flooded back into his starved lungs. Martha stood over both of them, the dying snake and the corrupt cop she had just saved, and wondered if she had made the right choice. Frank Morrison lay gasping on the cave floor, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath into his crushed lungs. Purple bruises were already forming around his neck and torso, where the python's coils had nearly squeezed the life from him. Martha stood over him, the blood-stained rock still clutched in her hands, watching as the man who had confessed to murder fought for every breath. "Martha!" Frank wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. You saved me." She looked down at him with a mixture of disgust and pity, her police training wearing with her personal revulsion. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness, Frank. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, not because you deserve it." Frank struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement sent waves of pain through his battered ribs. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and Martha could see that several of his teeth had been loosened by the python's crushing grip. He looked older, somehow diminished by his brush with death. "I need to tell you something," he said, his words coming in short, painful gasps. "About the Johnsons. I didn't kill them." Martha felt the world tilt around her as if the cave floor had suddenly become unstable beneath her feet. "What did you say I covered it up, Frank?" Continued each word an obvious effort. "I helped destroy evidence, falsified reports, steered the investigation away from the truth, but I didn't pull the trigger." The confession hit Martha like a physical blow, leaving her reeling with confusion and disbelief. Then, who killed that family? Frank's eyes closed, and for a moment Martha thought he had lost consciousness, but then he opened them, again focusing on her face with obvious difficulty. "Chief Patterson, he was running drugs through the evidence locker, selling confiscated narcotics back to dealers. The Johnsons. David saw him at the warehouse that night." Chief Patterson. Martha felt her legs give out, and she sank to her knees beside Frank's prone form. Harold Patterson had been her mentor, the man who had recruited her to the Springfield Police Department fresh out of the academy. He had been a legend in local law enforcement, respected and admired by everyone who worked under him. "You're lying," she whispered, but even as she spoke the words she knew Frank was telling the truth. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Patterson's sudden wealth in his final years, his expensive fishing trips and new cars on a police chief's salary, his unexpected heart attack 2 years ago, which had seemed to come out of nowhere for a man who had always been in excellent health. "I found out about the drug operation by accident." Frank continued, his breathing becoming slightly easier as his crushed windpipe began to recover. "Caught him loading evidence bags into his personal vehicle one night. He brought me in as a partner, said I could either join him or end up like anyone else who got in his way, so you chose to be his accomplice." Martha said, her voice thick with disgust. "I was young, stupid, scared." Frank replied, "Patterson made it clear what would happen if I refused. Look what he did to the Johnsons when they became a threat." Martha's mind was reeling, trying to process this new version of events. "But you said you were there that night, you helped cover it up?" Frank nodded weakly. "Patterson called me after he killed them. Said there was a mess that needed cleaning up. By the time I got to the Johnson house, they were all dead. David, Sarah, and little Emma lying in that drainage ditch. But Emma survived," Martha said. "She's alive." That's when I knew I couldn't do it anymore. Frank's voice broke with emotion that sounded genuine, seeing that little girl lying there so still and pale. "I thought she was dead, thought she Patterson ordered me to make sure to put another bullet in her head. But when I knelt down beside her, I could see she was still breathing." Martha stared at him in shock. "You let her live?" "I told Patterson she was dead, helped him stage the scene to look like a gang killing. But I called in an anonymous tip about an injured child in the drainage ditch. Made sure the ambulance found her in time." The revelation was almost too much for Martha to process. For 3 years, she had assumed that Frank Morrison was a cold-blooded killer who had murdered an entire family. Now she was learning that he had actually saved the only survivor, that his guilt came from being a coward rather than a murderer. "Why didn't you tell the truth?" she demanded. "Why didn't you come forward after Patterson died?" "Because I was a coward," Frank said simply. "Because I had spent 3 years living a lie, taking money from evidence seizures, helping cover up crimes. Even if I hadn't pulled the trigger, I was still guilty of conspiracy of accessory to murder. My career would be over. My life ruined." From deeper in the cave system came the faint sound of voices calling out. Searching, Martha's heart leaped with hope. Someone had finally realized they were missing and organized a rescue effort, but the voices were still far away, and she wasn't sure they would be heard over the echoing acoustics of the limestone chambers. "There's more," Frank said urgently, as if he could sense that time was running out. "Patterson hid evidence from the drug operation somewhere in these caves. Financial records, photographs, lists of dealers and corrupt officials. He told me about it before he died. Said it was his insurance policy." Where? Martha demanded. "I don't know exactly. Somewhere in the back sections, hidden in a waterproof container. He drew me a map, but I never had the courage to come looking for it." The voices were getting closer now, and Martha could make out individual words echoing through the cave system. Earl Thompson's distinctive rasp, calling her name. Dorothy Wilson's voice, high and frightened, asking if anyone had seen Cooper. The sound of their friends and fellow seniors searching for them filled Martha with a relief so profound it made her dizzy. "Grace," Martha said, suddenly remembering the unconscious child. "Is she safe? Is Rebecca with her?" Frank nodded weakly. "I never intended to hurt the child. I just wanted to find the evidence to clear my name. But when I saw that you and Rebecca had figured Out who Grace really was, you panicked, Martha finished. You thought we were going to expose you. I've been living in fear for 3 years. Frank admitted, every day wondering if Grace's memories would come back, if she would remember my face from that night. Even though I didn't kill her family, I was there, I helped cover it up in her eyes. I'm just as guilty as Patterson Cooper. Stirred weakly from where Martha had left him against the cave wall, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute, she looked at her faithful partner and felt her heart break all over again. Even if the rescue team reached them, soon she wasn't sure Cooper would survive long enough to get the medical attention he desperately needed. Martha Earle's voice echoed clearly through the cave system, now much closer than before. Martha, where are you? Can you hear us here? Martha called back, her voice cracking with emotion. We're here. Cooper's hurt badly. We need medical help. Frank struggled to sit up fully, wincing as the movement aggravated his injuries. Martha, I need you to know, I never stopped feeling guilty about what happened to the Johnsons every day for 3 years. I've thought about coming forward, about telling the truth, but you didn't. Martha said coldly. No, Frank admitted, I didn't, and that makes me just as much of a coward as Patterson said. I was. The rescue team's voices were very close now, accompanied by the sound of multiple flashlight beams cutting through the cave's darkness. Help was finally coming, but Martha couldn't shake the feeling that for Cooper it might already be too late. Male Earl Thompson, 67 years old, setting cave entrance, leading rescue team. Description: white American retired coal miner, emerging first with rescue flashlight, white hair and crew cut gleaming with relief, weathered rectangular face showing joy with kind blue eyes sparkling with success. Broad nose, wide triumphant smile, stocky build and flannel shirt, moving confidently through cave system. Heroic leadership posture, guiding team to victims. Skins color white American candid photography, dramatic rescue lighting with flashlight beams. Color photo female Martha O'Sullivan, 62 years old, setting helicopter with injured Cooper. Description: white American retired police officer sitting in medical helicopter beside Cooper's stretcher, silver gray shoulder length hair, wine-blown oval face showing desperate hope with brown eyes fixed on German shepherds, breathing straight nose, mouth moving in silent prayer, medium build and blood-stained clothes, protective vigil posture, refusing to leave partner side. Skins color white American candid photography, harsh medical helicopter lighting. Color photo male Cooper, 12 years old, setting veterinary hospital operating table. Description: 12-year-old male German shepherd on surgical table fighting for life, black coat with silver touched muzzle, cleaned but showing extensive injuries. Intelligent dark brown eyes closed under anesthesia. Noble rectangular head, intubated for surgery, muscular build surrounded by medical equipment. Surviving against odds posture, fur color black with silver markings, candid photography, sterile surgical lighting. Color photo female Grace Hayes, 7 years old, setting hospital room, fully recovered. Description: 7-year-old white American girl sitting up in hospital bed, completely healed, long brown hair and fresh pigtails, round cherubic face glowing with health, showing bright green eyes sparkling with life, small button nose, wide grateful smile, small frame in colorful hospital gown, energetic recovery posture, asking about Cooper. Skins color white American candid photography, bright hopeful hospital lighting. Color photo female Martha O'Sullivan, 62 years old, setting Springfield Memorial Park statue. Dedication. Description: white American retired police officer speaking at bronze statue. Unveiling ceremony, silver gray shoulder-length hair, neatly styled despite advancing Alzheimer's, oval face showing pride mixed with sadness as brown eyes reflect on Cooper's heroism. Straight nose, trembling but determined smile, medium build in formal dress, commemorative speech posture. Skins color white American candid photography, ceremonial golden hour lighting. Color photo male Cooper, 12 years old, setting Sunset Manor therapy work. Description: 12-year-old male German shepherd working as therapy dog despite permanent limp, black coat with silver ruched muzzle, now completely white around face. Intelligent dark brown eyes clouded with cataracts but still gentle, noble. Rectangular head resting beside elderly patient, muscular build showing age but spirit intact, healing service posture. Fur color black with extensive silver markings, candid photography, warm therapy room lighting. Color photo female Grace Hayes, 8 years old, setting memory garden, visiting Martha. Description: 8-year-old white American girl approaching Martha on garden bench, long Brown hair and neat pigtails bouncing with. Growth round face more mature, showing bright green eyes filled with love and gratitude. Small nose, joyful smile, growing frame in school clothes, carrying art supplies, devoted granddaughter. Posture, visiting honorary grandmother, skins color white. American candid photography, soft garden sunlight, color photo, female Martha O'Sullivan. 62 years old, setting Sunset Manor garden, final scene description. White American, retired police officer sitting peacefully in memory garden, silver gray shoulder length. Hair now completely white, oval face showing serenity despite Alzheimer's progression, with brown eyes. Still recognizing Cooper's presence, straight nose, gentle content. Smile, medium build and comfortable cardigan, peaceful twilight posture with faithful German Shepherd beside her, skins color white. American candid photography, golden sunset lighting, color photo.